Welcome back to the Black Belt Sofa. In this video, I'm revisiting questions I get about using CCTV at home, including Ring doorbells, Nest doorbells, and any other kind of security camera doorbell that you might capture people coming up to your front door or walking past your property. But first of all, if you're new to me, I'm a barrister who helps you understand law, so I'd be really grateful if you boop that like button and subscribe button if you aren't already. So many people don't like the idea that you are subject to data protection laws if you use CCTV or you use a doorbell, camera, capture device, whether it be audio or visual or both. But the truth of the matter is that you may well be caught by the data protection legislation, and that imposes certain things upon you, again, whether you like it or not, and whether you consent or not to that legislation. But that depends on what exactly your cameras will capture. So let's get into another overview. First of all, we should start with some questions about what it is you want to capture and why you want to capture it. For example, if you have a large car park or driveway and you are looking to protect the security of your vehicles or your storage units at the back of your property or whatever it might be, then it might be reasonable and justifiable to have a security recording device watching that area so as to A, deter criminals, and B, catch criminals in the act so you can alert police, and C, hopefully capture some of the criminal's face and so on to try to report them to the police. But the question then really comes as to whether or not what you capture is justifiable and proportionate. It's also necessary to consider how and where you store the information and for how long you keep it, because that's all down to proportionality, which is where the data protection legislation kicks in. Now, of course, this applies if you are a business as well, but most of the questions I seem to get, and most of the objections that I seem to get, are from people who are purely domestic household users and sort of object that data protection legislation applies to you, but it certainly might. So let's get into when it might apply to you and when you do need to consider data protection legislation. So thinking in terms of what you capture, how much you capture and for how long you keep it and so on, it really comes down to the curtilage and the boundaries of your property. But in a visual aspect, and whether it captures imagery of people who may be identifiable, but also you need to think very carefully about the audio that you capture. Because, for example, if you have a camera sitting on your fence and is trained only on your garden, but if it also captures audio and it could quite easily pick up the conversations of somebody next door, that is going to be extremely difficult for you to justify as being proportionate under data protection legislation. If your neighbour objected to your camera capturing audio whilst it's sitting on your fence, for example, they may well make a complaint to the ICO, which is the UK's regulator for data protection, and the ICO may take enforcement action against you, which can include a fine. But you may also find yourself the subject of litigation from your neighbour, which you may remember my previous video I discussed at length the case of Fairhurst and Woodard, in which there was a claim for breach of data protection and harassment, among other things, because of the way the material was used. Now, this brings up another question, which is how you use this information that you store, because it should only really be used for the purpose for which it was originally gathered. Now, of course, this predominantly applies to information which is that of another person, i.e. your neighbour next door whose conversations are being recorded by your device, or even people that walk past. Because, for example, let's say you have somebody walking past a certain building every day, but let's say that they aren't supposed to be walking past for whatever reason that might be, and yet they are caught on your CCTV. It's quite possible that that person will object to you recording them walking past and storing the recording of them walking past for any length of time, let alone indefinitely. So if your camera is capturing people beyond the boundaries of your property, even if they are just walking past, then they will have the right to make a data subject access request of you, which will include confirming to them what information you've gathered, but also the right to have it deleted, unless you can show some real lawful reason to keep it, which would usually be linked to some kind of crime and so forth. But in most cases, that's not going to be the case. But also, in the case of Fairhurst and Woodard, which I discussed in my previous video, the footage that was captured was used to threaten the neighbour of report to the police for various various things, even though he hadn't in fact made those reports to the police, but the threat made against the neighbour amounted to harassment in the court's view. If you do decide to capture imagery, and particularly if you capture audio, which I would usually suggest against doing so, but if you do decide to capture video and audio which is beyond the boundaries and the curtilage of your property, you should have a very legitimate and good reason for doing so, which you should write down somewhere, and you should note when you made that decision, why you made that decision, and what exactly you decided to capture, and what those purposes were. Now, as a purely household user for domestic purposes, there's no need for you to register with the ICO as a business would and pay any fee. But for those people that believe data protection legislation doesn't apply to you because it's a wholly household activity under the exemption under GDPR, that is not the case if, as I said, your cameras or other recording devices are capturing people beyond the curtilage of your property, because that is then beyond the bounds of something that is wholly household activity. And this brings up another very important point. If you are recording people outside of the boundaries of your property and then you decide to share that with somebody else, you could automatically be in breach of data protection legislation, because that's not the purpose, and unlikely to be the purpose or any legitimate purpose for which you would have captured that information in the first place. Much, much worse is if you were live streaming this on the internet and therefore the subjects being captured have no choice whatsoever that their images are being scattered across the internet for anyone and all to see. In those cases, if someone were captured being somewhere they shouldn't be at a time perhaps they shouldn't be there, maybe they should be at work and instead they're out for a stroll, and you are live streaming them on the internet and they get caught and lose their job, they may well have a claim against you for breach of data protection because you captured them without their consent and broadcast it to people again without their consent. Even worse still, now this is quite shocking because of the amount of people that have said to me that this is happening. When there's been a dispute between neighbours, some people have trained their CCTV on their neighbour's garden, watching everything they do. Worse still, watching children play and capturing children, and who knows for how long they are storing that imagery. This is clearly not acceptable, and I don't think you need a lawyer to tell you that this is not going to stand up to scrutiny if your neighbour takes you to court for breach of data protection and what might amount to harassment, because it may well cause alarm and distress if you are repeatedly capturing their children on CCTV and storing it for who knows how long. So I hope that helps to answer some of the questions. I will link my previous video, which was an in-depth discussion of that judgment, in the description below. But as always, if there are any more questions that pop up from this, please do put them in the comment section below. And as I said, if you're not subscribed to me already, I would really appreciate that if you subscribe and boop the like button. And as always, thank you for watching.